Good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Castillo, Housing Federation board member and Chief Regional Officer for PATH, which stands for People Assisting the Homeless. We provide services in more than 140 cities in 6 regions in California and have more than 1,500 units of permanent supportive housing completed or in the pipeline. Across the state, we help people find permanent housing and provide case management and linkages to medical and mental health care, benefits advocacy, employment training, and other services to help them maintain their home stably. Before we introduce our keynote, I'd like to invite Peter Bridge with Sun County Builders to say a few words. Peter?
Jonathan, let's see, are we here? We're almost here. There we go. There we go. Jonathan, thanks. And thanks to everybody who's attending today. It's great to be part of the conference, and let's hope that we see each other in person next year. When Sun Country took on its first affordable housing project in 1983, we didn't know that we were embarking on a lifetime of work in affordable housing, a lifetime of commitment to Californians in need, a lifetime of alignment with the missions of our clients and relationships with clients we've fallen in love with over the years. It's been a pleasure and an honor. When we learned that Marc Doan would be speaking today, we jumped on the opportunity to underwrite his time with us. Marc is taking on multi-pronged strategies to address the complex problem that is homelessness. A homeless person is not one profile, it's many different people. And Marc is offering so many varied ideas to approach that spectrum of need. We're enormously excited to underwrite his keynote. I look forward to hearing him, and I'm going to hand this back to Jonathan.
Thank you, Peter, for your words and sponsorship for today's keynote. Today's keynote speaker is Marc Doan, CEO for King County Regional Homelessness Authority. They are a social entrepreneur, a policy strategist, and social justice activist with over 10 years of experience in equitable systems transformation. Prior to taking on the role of inaugural CEO for the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, Marc was the founder and the executive director of the National Innovation Services, a consulting firm that helps governments redesign their approaches to support marginalized populations. PATH has had the privilege of working with National Innovation Services on our racial equity action plan. Marc also has held leadership roles in social impact, policy and program design, and continuous improvement at the Center for Social Innovations, commonly known as C4 Innovations. Marc is also a faculty member at the School of Visual Arts. Marc holds a degree from NYU in psychiatric anthropology and is an experienced equity trainer. Marc, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that kind introduction. I am really honored to be here with you all to have this conversation today. And I wanted to talk, sort of bridging off that intro a little bit about why I'm here, right? So ostensibly, I'm here because of many of those things that were just listed, because I am the CEO of an agency with $140 million budget charged with ending homelessness in one of the largest counties in the country. I'm here because I'm a social entrepreneur, which is a thing I still don't super know what that means, but like it's been ascribed to me, so we're going to roll with it. I'm here because, I led one of the largest studies conducted on homelessness, focused on race and disproportionate outcomes for folks experiencing homelessness. Those are the reasons why people always say that I'm here, right? That I'm virtually here in this case, but that I'm in front of rooms, that I'm talking, that I'm having the conversation. And I think that what's important for me at this point in my career is to sort of be really clear that that's not actually the reason why I'm here, right? The reason why I'm here is because when I was 14, I was a victim of sexual assault, which led to a significant battle with PTSD. I'm here because I was institutionalized twice, first at 16 and then again at 19. I'm here because of the fact that when I was living in New York City, for a period of time, I had to couch surf because I was broke and was trying to avoid having to stay outside. Those are the reasons why I'm here. And for a long time, I didn't tell anybody those things, right? Like not anyone in my professional life, right? Clearly, all of my friends knew, the folks who helped me stay inside when I needed to be inside knew, the folks who helped me get food when I needed food knew. But in my professional life, right, I really avoided talking about those things. And I avoided saying to people, oh, the reason why I know that particular intervention isn't going to work for someone who's experiencing, psychosis is because I've experienced psychosis and I know what it's like to need to be engaged with in a specific way because you're having that specific issue. I didn't tell anyone those things because I was concerned that if I told folks that I would not be taken seriously. And that in fact, right, if I was allowed to come sit at the table at all, I would be asked to come to the table in a tokenized fashion, right? That I would come there as a person with lived experience, a person with lived expertise, and not be taken seriously as a researcher, as a psychiatric anthropologist, as a person who could craft and implement policy. And so I kept all that, right? And so I would show up in conversations very much clear on what needed to be done and why it needed to be done, but always looking for another way to present that. And so frankly, much of my career as a researcher, much of the work that I've done in the field of housing and homelessness has been rooted in looking for vehicles to prove what I already knew. And I want to think about that a little bit today with you all, because I think it's really important that we recognize, right, that like what we have done inside our work historically, even as we begin to integrate people with lived expertise and lived experience, is that we still lean hard on tokenizing structures, right? We still lean hard on advisory boards. We lean hard on functions that don't have a lot of power, right? Traditional power. And I think it's really important that we have this conversation because even when I was applying for this job, when I was going through the confirmation process, I barely talked about the fact that, if I was selected, that I would be a person with lived experience charged with doing this work in a community that I love. And it was a real fear, right? That I would, again, not be taken seriously if I stepped into that. And I think what I want to sort of begin to unwind is that at this particular moment in our country, where we have some real serious choices in front of us about who do we want to be, whether or not we frankly want to continue to be a country that was founded on explicitly racist ideology, explicitly misogynistic ideology, or whether or not we want to transform. I think we also have to have a conversation about what leadership looks like in that moment, and who we allow to lead and why. And the reason why I think that's so critical is that we have to remember every day that this is a country that was founded on and predicated on, right, the success of white men. That's not a debate. That's not a jab at any of the white men that I know. That is a historical fact. And so oftentimes when we look at leadership and how leadership roles are designed, those roles continue to be designed to be operated by that particular leadership style, by a style that is culturally the style of white folks, culturally male. And so for me, right, to be a queer, non-binary Black person stepping into this role, I think that one of the things that I immediately realized is that stylistically, right, what I was bringing to the conversation was already really remarkably different, that my ideas about what it meant to do my job, about what it meant to, sort of conduct the right analysis to get to the right answers, the belief fundamentally, right, that people don't just have stories to tell, they have actual policy analysis to give to us, was the result of a different experience that I'd had, right, and a different way of having to navigate the world. And so what I'm here to say today, I think in a really banal way, is that it is true that the personal is political, but it's not just, right, that like that traditional sense of, what we experience has political ramification, or what we do has political ramification. It is that my experiences were political in their birth, right? Like how they came to be. And they can also be political in how I use them. And this is the conversation that I feel like is missing from leadership in our sector, right? Too often, we are still having these conversations about integrating people with experiences like mine, sort of through, again, these auxiliary functions, instead of having, I think, what is the core conversation, which is how do we ensure that people like me have adequate access to skills, resources, technology, whatever it may be, in order to acquire the appropriate analysis, the appropriate understanding to really bring our experiences into policymaking beyond storytelling. Like this is right at the core, what I think this country is desperately in need of, right? What our field is desperately in need of. We don't need stories anymore. What we need are solutions. And part of the reason why, as you heard briefly, that I am, particularly interested in multi-pronged solutions, that I am focused on, how do we respond to our folks who have high acuity needs, people like me who are experiencing psychosis and, are living outside. I didn't have to live outside, but I have a taste of what that's like, and know that it is quite complicated. The reason why I'm particularly interested in building out a peer navigation workforce, right, that can integrate across all of our different programs and systems and help really walk people from, unsheltered homelessness, perhaps living in an encampment, all the way through the experience of securing housing, again, comes from an understanding of what it's like to try to navigate those systems without someone that I trusted walking along beside me. But right, the reason why I'm able to think of all those things and point to all those things and work with our team to begin to design and implement them is because I have more than a story, right? I have something that goes past telling you my history. I have a present, right, that allows me to say, well, this is the policy solution here. And I want us to really think about what it means to step into crafting leadership positions for people more like me. And leadership, right? Power, not advisory positions, not on a board that we can engage with when we choose to, but leadership. That, I think, is the question in front of us. And with that, I think, comes some really fundamental questions about government, right? And about how we are going to do our work to best support people experiencing homelessness as we move forward with ending it. And some of that, I think, is in first recognizing that what we're doing isn't working. It's just not working, right? We have been through, oh gosh, I don't know, maybe I've lost count of the federal plans outside of USICH. But, nationally, right, we've had umpteen iterations of various 10-year, 5-year, 15-year plans, and we're still here, right? And so what that means is that we need to fundamentally recognize that like part of what we're doing is not a question of just the resources, although certainly we could always use more resources. It's also a question of whether or not it works, right? Whether or not the people who we support in getting into housing stay in that housing, whether or not they wind up back, right, experiencing unsheltered homelessness, sometimes within a year. There's a fundamental need for us to look real hard at those things and to understand that if we're going to actually deploy a justice framework, part of justice is reckoning. Part of justice is looking hard at what has happened, where we come from, who receives what supports and why, and then saying, and what are we going to do about it? And if we're going to actually have that reckoning moment, then what that must entail is an understanding that our leadership has to become more adaptive. Our leadership has to embrace innovation strategies, right? And I'm not talking about innovation strategies in the sense of, there's a tech startup that can, build a better mousetrap. I'm talking about innovation in the sense of recognizing and understanding what the core issue is. Part of what I see when I look at our system is that it's broken relationally, right? Meaning that there is not a container, right, to form a meaningful relationship that, again, you can use to help propel yourself through a fragmented system. And the reality is, right, that when you're trying to navigate that system, it's all about relationships. It's all about who do you trust to tell you the truth? Who do you feel like has your back, right? And when we don't understand that, when we don't prioritize those relationships, we get bad results. So thinking about what it means to identify and prioritize the right things is a real shift in how we think about the work of government, the work of nonprofits, right? To really orient towards the kind of relational infrastructure instead of what we've oriented for many years towards, which is essentially widget counting, right? Like how many touch points or how many program exits, right? And not really looking at the quality or qualia, right? To pull from anthropology, right? Of those interactions, right? What does it mean? What does it really mean? Again, from a justice framework, if we think about the fact that many of the people who need to interact with the things that we provide don't rate those things highly, and in fact say that they are harmful. What does it mean if we say, well, that doesn't matter? What matters instead is that we get the kind of program exit that we need. I think that what we need to recognize is that there have become a little bit of a culture of the ends justify the means in this field and in the space broadly, I think, of how we deal with folks from historically marginalized communities. And inside that is a lot of really, I think, troubling paternalism that at its core rests on the logic that we believe that people don't know what's best for themselves, that they don't know how to articulate how to move forward with their own lives. Instead of understanding what I think is actually true, which is that people are in crisis, and if we assist people in navigating to stable points, then they can make the best decisions for themselves, right? And our job is to engineer those plateaus, those places of rest, right? Where people are able to make those good decisions. But I think that what that also requires is that we step into an understanding that there is, in moving forward from old ways and into new ways of doing things, there is always a little bit of risk. And the risk, right, is of course that something might not go precisely as we intend, that there could be conflict, or that we might design a program and see that it really does not support people in moving on the way that we wanted, and we might have to go back to brass tacks. That kind of work, right, is the kind of work I believe that we need to be fundamentally leaning to in order to do our job in the next several years and really put this country on a path to ending homelessness. Because what we have to understand is that while we understand how to house some folks, we are, again, not housing a lot of folks who we need to be more supportive of. And so if we're going to step forward into supporting those people, we're going to have to do new things. And some of those new things might not work the way that we want. But de-risking, right? Like taking that idea of something not potentially working and making it as safe as possible really just means that what we should be oriented towards as we stand up new things is ensuring that no one is permanently harmed, right? But that there may be moments when something does not work the way that we intend, and we do have to course correct. But course correction on something that we tried and didn't work the way that we wanted is much, much better than continuing to do things that we know simply don't produce the results that we want. That's the truth. The truth is that if we continue to do what we have done for the last 40 years, we will be doing it in 80 years. And that if we want different things, we're going to have to do different stuff. That's the reality. And so when you think about, or when you all are being asked to think about over the course of this convening, leadership, right? What I want you to be thinking about, what I'm hopeful that you will take from this, is a conversation that is about an innovation culture that requires an adaptive way of leading that is rooted, right, in real grounded understanding of how things work. And that grounded understanding comes from experience. It comes from having had to walk those paths. There's a reason why I find myself having to explain things, right, to large groups of white people, versus where if I'm talking to a large group of Black people, I can just say a fragment and everybody nods their head. There's a reason. We have different experiences in this country. And when we look at a population, the population experiencing homelessness, and acknowledge that it is disproportionately people of color, and that in fact, right, if we were to en masse end homelessness for just folks of color and folks from historically marginalized communities in this country, we would really end homelessness for at least, quick back of the napkin math, at least 2/3 of people. And that's just looking at race ethnicity. If you start to include folks who are living with disability, we're talking about ending homelessness for probably up to like 85, maybe even 90% of folks, right? But in order to do that, there is a requirement, right? Again, that like the people who are leading be able to access that knowledge directly, which I believe means that they have to have lived it. What I'm not saying, and I want to be really clear about this, is that there is no place for people who don't have lived experience in this field. But what I am saying is that it might be time for us to shift our roles a little bit and to think really, really hard about what it means, again, if we're serious about justice, to transfer power. And so many of you, right, might sit in seats of power right now and might find this challenging. But I want to say really clearly that just because the role that you currently have might not be the role that you should have moving forward doesn't mean there aren't other roles. But it is time, I think, for us to evaluate that as a culture, as a community. I think it's time for us to really say that, again, if we're serious about justice, that we have to be serious about the reckoning. We have to be serious about where we've come from and where we're headed. And I think that's all I've got today. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you all directly.
Well, thank you, Marc. I've been watching comments. A lot of people have been texting me, and I may read some of them later. First of all, I want to, you don't know me so well, you don't know our organization so well. So I should tell you that I am a queer cisgender male, and becoming a senior very rapidly as well. So that's who I am. But I also have, and a California native, so that my whole worldview is shaped by that. The folks that are here listening today, I've been scrolling through the list, and a lot of folks who are directly in services. There's the head of agencies, there are developers. So we have the sectors here. And I think that's really important. That's why it's important that you're here with us today. We're going to ask for other questions, but I'd like to start off by kind of framing the fact that you're building an agency from the ground up. You are creating a whole new structure here. And when you talk about crafting leadership positions, can you talk about some of the ways in which the structure of this brand new organization is reflective of the principles that you've been talking about?
Yeah. So a couple of things. First, just in terms of oversight, like the two oversight bodies we have, a governing committee and an implementation board. Governing committee is made up of electeds. They have a set of specific roles in terms of budget approval and my confirmation. But that body also includes people with lived experience. And they make up a third of that voting block and are, I believe, all people of color at last count. And then on the implementation board, similarly, we have a whole bunch of requirements around forms of expertise. And one of those forms of expertise is lived experience. And again, folks on that board, which is the board that I directly report to, have lived experience. And I just want to be clear, like I report to that board, right? So like I have a lot of power in my job. But like when we talk about the difference between an advisory board versus a board with power, right? Like that is a board that like could dismiss me if they wanted to, right? And that's really different than I think what a lot of other folks are operating inside of. The other thing in terms of my team directly, right, that we've really looked at is, so one, I have a director of justice and equity initiatives who sits on our senior team, who is responsible, and I want to be really clear about this, that's a strategist role, it's not an HR role. And I think a lot of times when we talk about justice and equity initiatives, they are like internally facing, like, you know, how do we have X, Y, or Z culture, instead of talking about like, what is our impact in the community and how are we working with community in order to ensure that what we're doing is informed. We also have an equity-based decision-making framework, which sits over as broad policy across everything that we do. And has very specific steps in it for how we do things like procurement, how we do things like hiring, et cetera. All of our job descriptions have specific requirement for racial justice and social equity fluency in concepts. And there are interview questions connected to those concepts, right, for every hiring committee. We also have done a really hard look at pay equity. And so ensuring that we're paying a livable wage allows us to, I think, frankly, attract talent out of, you know, some of the pools, I think, that we typically don't see people applying from because they feel like they can't make the amount of money that they need to make. And we also, you know, have just done a really, really solid job of looking to ensure that every pipeline is representative. And so, and when the pipeline looks bad, we pause the process and cast a wider net and like really actively engage with folks. So, you know, we consider pipeline creation to be, you know, a core responsibility of ours, right, in terms of the hiring process. And if the pipeline looks very homogenous or doesn't include any people with lived experience, then we consider that to be a pipeline development failure, and we pause the process and redo recruitment.
No, that's powerful, and it sounds like also it means you're taking time. You're investing a lot of time to do this. When you talk about equipping people with the skills and knowledge to be in places of power, can you comment a little bit on what some of the skills you think they need are, or how we can help people develop those skills? It's a cultivation question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question, you know, my question is, what are the skills, right? And so before we talk about like, how do we help people develop skills, I think that the question that we have to be asking is like, what are the core skills? Some of that, I think, is stuff that we have made, like we as bureaucrats, right? And I've been a bureaucrat for over 10 years. It's not disrespect for bureaucracy, but the way in which we have constructed our world is incredibly technocratic technocratic and requires a really high level of fluency in stuff we made up, right, in order to play. And we judge people on whether or not they know the stuff we made up in terms of whether or not they are like adequately skilled in order to play ball. And I think that in actuality, right, like those aren't the right skills, right? Like I can teach anyone about budget, right? Like that takes actually 10 minutes of time, right? To be like, this is how a budget works. But what I can't teach you is how to evaluate whether or not a space is, well, I mean, I could, it just takes a lot longer to evaluate a space for its therapeutic capacity, right? Like whether or not a space has the ability to promote calm and to promote healing. That is something that it takes actually much longer to learn, and frankly is better learned either through practitioner, right? Like you have tried to provide care in spaces or you have tried to receive care in those spaces. Those are the best ways to understand that, right? And so I think the question is, if we strip out the technocratic stuff, then what remains? And if the answer is very little, then I think we prioritize the wrong skills. And I think that, for those of us who have acquired positional power, it's on us to advocate and to really hold the line and say, this person may not be speaking to you in object class codes for budget, but that doesn't mean that what they're saying isn't valuable for this conversation, right? Or like, if they don't know like the procedures and regulations for procurement in your jurisdiction, that doesn't mean they don't know what should be funded, right? Like those are really different conversations. And so the other thing that I would say is like, rather than looking to skill people, think about how you can create teams that are more innovative, right? So like, when I first started, I worked with, I was a program person, and I had a counterpart in our procurement division. And so I did not have to know any of I was in Massachusetts. I didn't have to know any of those rules, right? I had to know what the program needed to do and why that made sense, right? And then I would turn to Alyssa and I'd say like, okay, how do I get this done? And she would spin up the stuff that you need a law degree to do, right? That kind of teaming structure, I think, can be really effective without saying, oh, you don't have the skills to play ball.
So more trust-based rather than hierarchical
Yes.
Structures, it sounds like. Well, and so in terms of connecting people with lived experience to opportunities, I mean, one of the challenges there, of course, is something that struck me to the heart was a man who came to a public hearing to say that he had been homeless previously, and afterwards he was shaken because it was harder for him to come out as homeless than it ever was to come out as gay. And and that's a moving moment there. So, I mean, if we're going to help connect people with lived experience, these opportunities, I mean, there's some barriers there. I mean, there's obviously trust barriers. Do you have any thoughts about how we create those opportunities and how do we provide paths for folks with that experience to rise for that?
Yeah, I think one of the first things, right, is again, sort of acknowledging a history of harm, right? So there is a difference, a significant difference between an equity framework and a justice framework, right? And I tried to talk about this a little bit, but thank you for giving me a window to talk about it more. So equity frameworks say, from this point forward, we're going to, eliminate disproportionality, or we're going to, look to make sure that outcomes are in line with need, et cetera, or investments are in line with need, et cetera, right? Which is great. We love that. Justice frameworks ask, why is it so bad right now, right? Justice frameworks fundamentally incorporate history into their work and ask the question of, where, like, if we have underinvested in one place, where have we overinvested? And what, again, reckoning is necessary in order to really make that right. And some of the reasons why, again, I started talking very publicly about, I came out for the first time when I was 12, and then came out as non-binary in my 20s. both of those I was having public conversations about well before I started talking about like, oh, I have this mental health history. Oh, I've couch surfed. So that really resonates with me. And I think part of it is we have to recognize that we have created an ongoing environment of harm, right, around those kinds of experiences, that makes it really difficult for anyone to see a pathway that doesn't involve exposing themselves to potential harm, right? And so that's what I'm saying, that like when a justice framework or the use of a justice framework would call us to say, here's what we have done historically, it is harmful, it is causing ongoing harm. Here is how we're going to reckon with that and provide some sort of real clear shift and potentially, right, even recompense for people who we have. And that, I think, is what allows people to see themselves as inside an environment that is actually safe, instead of an environment that just, frankly, continues to brand itself as justice-oriented or equity-oriented, but like the actual material reality is still the same.
Well, so some of the work, when you talk about, are people telling their stories? Is the story enough? I mean, I think my experience has been that some of telling the stories about overcoming stigma, like helping people to understand that this, that they see someone who is a cognate of themselves, that they can say, this could be me. Do you discount that value, or do you find that, what is your experience with that kind of destigmatization? And is that valid work for us to be doing?
I guess my question in response is like, has it actually destigmatized anything? Like, I don't know that it has, right? Like, I don't know that we've, I don't know that we've told stories that have actually destigmatized. I think there is a difference between sympathy and empathy, right? And to be sympathetic to something is not the same as to empathize with it. And I think that like a lot of our storytelling work has generated a fair amount of sympathy that we've used at times to, pass budget bills or go to the voters with something. But I don't know that it has generated true empathy. To my mind, I think it's the empathy that actually lowers the stigma, right? Like if I feel like you can genuinely project your consciousness into some portion of my life, that I feel like is where we see stigma actually decline, as opposed to, I think, some of the other things, which are, there's a reason why we have the term poverty porn, right? Like we have for many, many years. Like I'm thinking back to like the terrible advertisements from when we were all younger of for just pennies a day, you can support a poor child in Africa. And, and then just like a picture of a small black kid with like flies on their face, right? And just like that was so inappropriate. Like, and at no point did it generate actual understanding of like what has been done to the peoples of the African continent, right? And so I think that that's my sort of question back is like, what has the storytelling really gotten us? And if there is a reason to tell the story, I think that the reason to tell the story should be incorporated into, and so that is why I know X, right? And that's often what we stop at just the story, right? Like, come on up here and tell us all how you managed to go from streets to shelter to your housing, right? We don't then say, and like, what did that teach you about how our system is broken and what we should be doing differently, right? We don't bring people into the actual policy conversation. We use them as source material.
Okay. No, that's really illuminating there. So I guess another question I have here, I have a more technical question with regards to the challenge of working during the COVID pandemic and the setbacks that local, regional, federal efforts to curb homelessness, have those been deeply impacted by COVID, or have there been opportunities created by the crisis?
I think all crisis is an opportunity, is how I would say it, or how I would see it. I think that like COVID, I remember in March of last year, which feels like, what's time anymore? But I remember in March of last year, sitting with a group of national policy strategists talking about, what are we going to do? We've got this emerging pandemic. It looks like it's going to be pretty bad. We just, I think it was like the end of February that I took my last trip basically. And then, and I remember, being in that conversation, and there were two of us, as I recall, who were saying, well, this is going to devastate historically marginalized communities, right? Like this is going to be terrible for Black folks, for Native folks, for folks living with disabilities. And the response I got was very sort of like, well, it's disease, so it's equal opportunity. And I was like, what? This has never been true. This has never been what? And then of course, right, it played out the way that it played out. So I think that I want to be really clear when I say that the opportunities here are as they have traditionally been, I think, in this country, built on people's bones, right? And we should be really cognizant of that. But I think we also demonstrated really clearly that when push comes to shove, we actually can just bring people inside, right? Right? That we can take housing first and make it more than a platitude and say we're gonna buy all these hotels, we're gonna buy all this housing, and we're just gonna move people into it, right? I think it fundamentally forced, particularly those of us in the public sector, to rethink our acquisition strategies and to say there are two paths to housing: development and acquisition. And I think we'd been really locked in development dogma of just we build stuff and then people can move in, and then we build stuff and then people can move in. And so everything was about what is the financing mechanism for development, instead of well, do we just have enough money to buy it? And that I think has been really transformative. And I think that, the fundamentals of homelessness are that it's economic, right? That's also a thing that we should remind ourselves of all the time. People experience homelessness because they don't have enough money. You may have other concerns, right? You may have substance use concerns, you may have, psychiatric concerns, but so do a lot of people who are housed. They have those concerns in their living rooms, right? As opposed to what we've done to other folks, which is say have those concerns outside. And so if we understand the fundamental positioning or the cause of homelessness as economic, then what that means is that we respond with economic solutions and material solutions, right? And so we say, how do we generate more places for people to be? And I think we really saw during the pandemic that we actually can do that really quickly. We just have to now not let up. We have to keep doing it. If we kept doing what we're doing now and did it truly at scale, we could be done 7-ish years max.
Well, I believe that. And so, well, let's lead to the next question I'd want to ask, which is, given that there is some need for development, especially in an area, I assume Kings County has some of the same issues as all coastal America, which is there's just a lot of people, more and not enough housing. The development solution is a longer term thing. The acquisition strategy can be quicker, but not always instantaneous, because things have to be made suitable sometimes. But then there's always discussions about, for instance, safe camps versus, because congregate shelters are just, that to me seems like something you live in the day after an earthquake, not for months. But in an emergency, if we had an earthquake, I mean, we would have all the families, all the suburban families living in MASH style tents until they were rehoused from day one. So safe camps, that brings up the issue as one of the tools that we have. Is that something, I mean, you must have some research and experience there. Can you comment on what seems to me is an opportunity for folks to have more agency in the smaller unit of housing versus a congregate tent, and a little more permanence. Anyway, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think my position has been relatively clear for quite some time, which is like outside is not inside, and like inside is what we need, right? Like, and so, there are a lot of folks who say, oh, well, we don't have we don't have the space, we don't have the da da da. And I would push back pretty hard on that and say, if we do, I mean, so for example, in King County, we have a significant difficulty around housing from a density perspective, because the vast majority of our county is zoned single family. It's from a development perspective, it's a nightmare. But that doesn't mean we don't have the space. It just means that space is literally in the form of single family and sometimes multifamily dwelling, right? It's not in the style of large scale apartment building, but like we could house everybody who needs our support buying homes, 100%, right? Like full stop. And in many coastal communities, that is true. We don't let ourselves see that reality because it is so far outside what we have historically thought of as the solution. I also want to point out that, like, coming out of this pandemic, I mean, Amazon just announced, and, they're big in our town and a lot of other towns actually, but, Amazon just announced that they kind of have no plan to bring people back to the office. They're kind of like, well, just be available in case you need to come in, right? And I think that with a lot of businesses like indicating that they're going to trend in that direction, I think that there's a substantive question about what the commercial space actually becomes utilized for, right? Like we have these massive structures now that like ostensibly are going to sit like relatively vacant because they are, large scale commercial towers, right? Like with very little, I mean, occasionally they have apartments on top, but very few of them actually, like many of them are just straight up commercial space, right? Like, I think, to your point about the acquisition plus, the amount of time necessary to potentially retrofit stuff, I think the retrofitting of some of these large commercial towers is something that we need to be looking at in the near term, right? To say, well, how does this become potential housing space? And then the last thing I'll say is just that, like, when we look at and this I think is something that I think we just need to keep in mind for our federal advocacy and state level advocacy, but when we look at our city and county level housing markets, I just can't stress enough that they are broken, right? And they need profound regulation, and much of that, frankly, first needs to come in the form of reparations, right? To like historically displaced people who are now experiencing homelessness in spaces that are theirs. But then after that, we must recognize that our housing market is experiencing market failure. That's what this is, right? Oftentimes we talk about market failure as like, oh, like it's currency and it's inflation, right? But market failure can also happen when there is a core component of the market, like housing, that becomes out of reach for the majority of the population. That is a form of market failure. And that's what this is. And the only way to intervene in market failure is regulatory action, right? Like there's nothing out that like, people walking down the street can do about fundamental market dynamics.
Well, so I'm looking to see, I'm going to ask folks again, if you have any other questions you want to send in, please do at this time. I have one question. I know that Jonathan Castillo, he'll have the last question as when we wrap up here. I mean, you're looking from Washington, if you're looking at California, I mean, are there tools that we've created in California that you wish you had in Washington as a state policy, or vice versa?
I think you've done some really incredible work with the home key stuff. I think it's really smart. I think that like the stuff that is actually some of the most exciting to me in the home key stuff, which is super wonky and nerdy, is there was state work that significantly lessened the regulatory requirements around going through, transitioning a space into housing, right? And so, around environmental impact review and like some of the things that like oftentimes community review, some of the things that like can really hold up that kind of movement. You all did some really brilliant work around making easier when the goal was to provide housing for folks like 30% AMI or below. And I just think that that's actually really, really, really smart. And so I would love for us to do more of that. I'd love for us, nationally to do more of that. I think a thing that, I would say we are doing pretty well in the recent days that I think would be well taken given some of the complexity of your jurisdictions is unified approaches, right? So setting up regional entities, I think, is really important. People are not jurisdictionally bound, and like, the sort of lines between a city and a county are sometimes quite arbitrary, but oftentimes have significant impact on what a person can access, right? Depending on, what side of the street they're on, sometimes quite literally, right? Like I'm thinking of one jurisdiction, not in California, although you might have some of these, but where if you're on one side of the street, literally on one side of the street, you don't have access to intimate partner violence supports, right? So those are DV supports for folks who aren't using that lingo, but and just literally like no access. You have to be on the other side of the street. And so like, that doesn't make any sense. And so I think that we really need to be thinking regionally and thinking about how to use our resources in regional ways to really wrap around people in terms of how people move as opposed to how we see borders.
Wonderful. Well, I think those are the last of the questions I had from our people. I'm going to hand it off to Jonathan here in a second, but before I go, I just really want to thank you for coming and being a part of our conference today. I see we've got nearly 100 folks who are watching this and who are dedicated to solving the issue of homelessness, and really, so we're honored to have you here. It is really a pleasure of mine to be able to have a conversation with you. And I hope that in future years we're going to be doing this in person. We would love to have you back because I know you have an energy that I would love for us all to be able to enjoy in person. So with that, I'm going to hand you off to Jonathan Castillo, who's going to ask a question, go to our outro. So thank you, Marc.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marc. I feel energized listening to your experience and speaking about ideas. And, I think one of the things that came to mind as I'm thinking about how do we incorporate people with lived experience to inform policy and program design. As providers, how do we know as providers that we serve a lot of special populations and subcultures that exist. How do we ensure as providers that, we have the voices represented at the table to make sure that it's representing the broad needs of everyone that we serve?
I think this is a really complicated question because the quick answer is, well, you make sure that the communities most impacted are able to sit at the table, right? But the long answer is that like you have to start making decisions about who is community and what most impacted means, right? And so, I think that one of the things that I can't advocate enough for is as much as possible, slow down. And I know that that's hard, right? Like crisis response requires that we move quickly. But I think that we often forget that it is possible to move quickly while also having deliberative and contemplative gating moments, right? That don't slow down the overall execution. And so I think that the big thing is just like when you're looking to design or implement or do something new, think early on about like, well, when are we going to pull people in to co-design? When are we going to pull people in to, really think meaningfully about, X, Y, or Z, and map out that process and have it like really clearly laid out from the beginning. So it might be, okay, we're going to go get the money for it first. And then we're going to sit down with everybody and say, how do we co-design the program, right? Or we're going to co-design the program and then go get whatever it's going to be, right? Like always know when and where you are touching base with people and start that conversation as early as you can. The other thing that I would just say is like, and perhaps in closing, going back to what I was saying before is sometimes the reason why the process is so slow is because you look around the room and realize no one in it is actually situated to inform what should be happening, right? And that's a warning bell, right? So that's when we go back to this question of like, who's leading and why, right? Because if it turns out that you can't actually do anything with your leadership because that leadership is not situated to inform process or strategy design, then that means that it's time for leadership to change probably. Because that's the job of leadership, right? Is to craft and execute strategy. And if you can't do that nimbly and quickly, because you're constantly having to run very complex external processes, that means that your leadership is probably not situated within community in the right way.
Thank you very much again. I think the most powerful thing that I walked away with today is it doesn't stop with this story. How does it inform policy and program design? So thank you again, Marc. And as a reminder, immediately following this keynote, there's a speed networking and Whova to connect with attendees. The link will be posted in the chat as well. Be sure to visit the virtual exhibitor space. Thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to Marc, and enjoy the rest of your conference.